Yeah, 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 yeah. This shit feel like I won't ever make it home. Traffic's backed up, I got to get off of this road.
From St. Petersburg and Brooklyn, this is She's in Russia. I'm Lily.
And I'm Smith.
That was fast. Did you see how fast I did it? It was like a lightning intro. What's today's topic? We're speaking with a very special guest, Yulia Gorbunova, who is a researcher in the Europe and Central Asia division of Human Rights Watch. We're talking about a report on domestic violence in Russia.
Right, that she wrote, that came out at the beginning of November.
Yes, that she researched and wrote. Okay.
Running all red lights, turning left, go right. I know bro, go right. I'm on go tonight.
Yulia, do you want to just start by introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Yulia Gorbunova, and I'm Russia researcher at Human Rights Watch.
Yeah, and we're interviewing you today because you wrote this report. How long has it been now? Like about 2 months ago published?
Yeah, it was published in early November.
Okay. It's entitled, I Could Kill You and No One Would Stop Me, Weak State Response to Domestic Violence in Russia. Okay, so I think a good place to start is to just talk about what the decriminalization of domestic violence in Russia means from a legislative standpoint. So could you just walk us through that timeline?
Sure. So basically, when we say that domestic violence was decriminalized in Russia in 2017, what that refers to is a very worrying step that the government took in February 2017, which effectively resulted in protections for victims of domestic violence that existed becoming even narrower and even weaker than they were before. From a legislative viewpoint, basically, decriminalization meant that first offense of what's called family battery, a first offense of family violence that did not cause significant harm to health, requiring hospital treatment, became decriminalized. So basically, violence that leads to serious injuries like broken bones or concussion remain criminalized, but anything less than that became a non-criminal offense. That new law applies to violence against any family member, including women and children. And here I have to, make a sort of little stop just to provide some context and explain that domestic violence survivors were never really effectively protected in Russia. The law enforcement, judicial system, social system simply did not protect or support domestic violence victims, even if they faced and when they faced severe violence. But decriminalization made things a lot worse. So it was definitely a step in a wrong direction for a country like Russia, where domestic violence has very high prevalence. And it was a very, very disheartening moment for activists that fought to combat domestic violence and, for people who also faced it in their lives. So, it basically was perceived by many as basically the government saying that it gives a green light to violence within family. Like the government was saying it's okay to beat your wife. And basically that new legislation that we talked so much about and that I've written a report about basically created a situation where abusers, perpetrators of domestic violence could get away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. And it led to fairly serious consequences, and it continues to cause a lot of harm to domestic violence survivors in Russia. And like I said, there are already severe barriers to justice in Russia for domestic violence victims, and the system is stacked against them basically from the first step to the last. There's no law on domestic violence in Russia. There's no definition of domestic violence. The police does not work effectively, etc., etc.
Yeah, I was curious about this kind of distinction that Russian law doesn't define domestic violence separately from other forms of violence. Why is that significant?
Well, that is actually a crucial point, because Russia does not only Russia does not have a separate law on domestic violence, but it doesn't also separately define domestic violence. It's not a criminal offense. It's not any kind of offense because there's no definition in national legislation of what domestic violence is. So what that means in practice is that domestic violence isn't seen as any different than, an assault on the street by a stranger. And it's actually taken less seriously than public assault, because at least when it's public, then there's a high chance that the police will intervene and stop it. Whereas when it happens behind closed doors, there's very, very little chance of that happening. And that's exactly where our legislators are incredibly wrong. And that's exactly where we have this huge gap that leads to so many women in Russia being, maimed and sometimes killed every year due to domestic violence, is the fact that domestic violence is very different from violence perpetrated by a stranger. It has, very specific features. It's described in international treaties for that reason, because it has very specific characteristics that make it different from any other type of violence that could be codified in national legislation. And those features include things like, it being cyclical. So it usually repeats in time. It has a very dangerous tendency to very quickly escalate. And it may start with a slap, but then it can quickly become a lot worse. And another thing that makes it different is that this sort of situation of dependency, which so frequently accompanies it, because victims and survivors of domestic violence, they often live together with perpetrators. They are often economically dependent on them. Sometimes they have children together, and they very often have nowhere to go. And domestic violence is a very latent crime everywhere, which means it's universally underreported. Women who statistically suffer from domestic violence more than men and children, they usually don't report it due to stigma, due to fear. Sometimes it takes years for women to come forward to report it. And when they do, there has to be a system in place to support them. So, those are aspects of domestic violence that make it a lot more dangerous and very different than an isolated assault or battery. And it really needs to be treated as such in national legislation.
You mentioned, I just wanted to get a little bit more specific about the types of punishment or something that somebody could get for what you said is like a slap on the wrist, this the result of the decriminalization. As I understood it, it's that can be an administrative offense, that's something like a fine or something. Could you give a few more details of what exactly that looks like, and also just what is that legal move from public to private? What's so problematic about that?
Oh, sure. Okay, so this is actually quite a big question. So let's start by saying that roughly only 3% of all domestic violence cases ever make it to court in Russia, according to estimates by lawyers who work in domestic violence cases, by activists that have been working on this issue for many years. And basically, like I said, the system is really stacked against domestic violence survivors when they do want to take their abuser to court. When we're talking about administrative cases, which what a lot of cases of domestic violence became classified as after decriminalization, the penalties are significantly reduced from what it used to be. So when it was a criminal offense, there was, first of all, a criminal record, which is very strong deterrent for for people who don't want to end up with a criminal record. And that's, one of the main functions of criminal penalty is that you can have a criminal record which will make your life a lot more difficult. In addition to that, fine was also an option for penalty, and also some time in jail was part of the sanction for certain types of violence that resulted in certain type of injuries, basically. So to simplify it all, after decriminalization, there's a very high chance that a woman who's been battered by her partner or husband who tries to get assistance from the police will either be told that her injuries are not sufficient and serious enough to initiate a criminal case and will be sent into administrative proceedings. And as a result of those administrative proceedings, the standard penalty is a 5,000 ruble fine. That's roughly, I think, $79, if I'm not mistaken. Because the statute of limitation for administrative offenses is a year, basically, if a year passes, then the abuser can go on with beating the woman, and the penalty is equal to penalty that is, for instance, is used for offenses such as smoking where it's prohibited or parking in the wrong place. So it just creates this perception, and many. I've interviewed a number of people for the report, and they all said that there's this sort of newly discovered idea that abusive men in Russia obtained is that nothing will be done to them if they beat their partner, and the worst that can happen is the same as what you get for parking your car in the wrong place, and that obviously is incredibly it has quite a strong impact on the spike in domestic violence that we've been seeing.
Right. You and your team did a lot of interviews with a bunch of different people, 27, I believe, of whom were survivors of domestic violence. And so for the listeners, this report is a kind of weaving of the context, the legal context, and then also these stories from specific women. And I mean, it's infuriating to read. And so much of the time that I was reading it, especially in police responses to women, where women would be in a situation where their husband or partner was attacking them or beating them, and they would call the police, and the police would kind of either show up and shrug their shoulders, or they would be sympathetic, but they would suggest that the woman not provoke her husband so much, or they would talk to the husband as if that was going to do anything. And it's all kind of under this banner of traditional values, which was a phrase that was used a lot in the rhetoric of the decriminalization of domestic violence. So could you talk a little bit about that role of quote traditional values?
Sure. Look, I mean, Russian politics, Russian social processes as a result have been dominated by conservative trend for a number of years now. And that's been strengthening and increasing that trend since Vladimir Putin returned to power in 2012. And, it's a very clear sort of strategic almost choice that Russian authorities have made in taking that traditional course, because their goal is to send a very clear message to the world, to the West, that Russia is, following its unique path. It's different from the West. Russia's present and future is all about traditional values, strong family, faith and religion. Unfortunately, Russia is not unique in that, in sort of trying to use traditional values as this. There are many ways in which idea of traditional values can be used, and unfortunately, in Russia's case, as in many other countries' cases, that message of traditional values frequently translates into completely non-human rights friendly messages of homophobia, state and church merging effectively, state persecuting other religious groups and religious minorities. And in Russia's case, the traditional values rhetoric in relation to domestic violence was very harmful, because with that rhetoric, when it sort of became stronger, it also revitalized and sort of normalized stereotypes about domestic violence that were already quite prevalent in Russian society, but perhaps, dormant in the 90s. And Russia is, it's a very conservative, patriarchal country. So there's very little surprise that there are very deeply ingrained attitudes of male dominance, men having more important role, or women having to, bear difficulties in the family, keeping it quiet, whatever problems they might have, including violence for the sake of their children, things like that. All these attitudes about violence in the family being women's own fault, that they provoked violence, they should tolerate violence for the sake of their children, etc., etc. So those perceptions are, common, and they're widely spread in Russia. But unfortunately, when this traditional values rhetoric in that context and with that, with those implications, when it's voiced by influential people, especially by government officials, which is what happened in February 2017, and in the period of time leading up to that, when decriminalization was discussed very actively in parliament, in public sphere. There are a lot of discussions. It was a very big topic in Russia at the time. But, and it sent this message that beating your wife or your partner is not only allowed, but it's also somehow a traditional value, and it's really shameful. It's incredibly wrong, because, it flips the issue completely upside down, because the state should protect the victims and not the abusers. And violence within family is not a manifestation of any traditional value. And, just to give you an example to kind of show that I'm not exaggerating, there was this member of parliament called Elena Mizulina, who very actively was basically the force behind decriminalization of domestic violence. And when she argued for decriminalization, she said, she talked all this nonsense about Russian families being strong and women, have this role of keeping their men happy and whatever, cooking and things like that. But she also said, it's basically a direct quote. She said, even when a man beats his wife, it's not as bad as when a woman humiliates a man or her husband. And this quote really says it all, because it's of course incredibly ridiculous, to us, but it's also very dangerous, because, like I said in the beginning, it's basically a message to abusers, violent, dangerous people from the government or from parliament, saying, you know what, it's fine to beat your wife, and she should be quiet and tolerate it, because you're a man and you're allowed. And it's incredibly. It's insane that it's happening in the 21st century, and it's insane that it's not just some kind of isolated, crazy people saying that, but it's basically state sanctioned policy. It is maddening.
Yeah, it's really insane to me how successful they were at essentially equating traditional values with domestic violence, and that was successful somehow. I don't know, it's really scary and horrible. And
yeah. I mean, I have to say that public perceptions are shifting somewhat in Russia, but it's still the side of viewing violence within family as sort of normal part of life, and viewing gender-based violence as normal part of life. And it's very harmful. If we're talking about domestic violence, it's very harmful for victims of domestic violence, because the perceptions are shared by police, because police they do what they're taught to do, and they when I was doing research for this report, I was just blown away by the stories that victims told me, how police, they would treat them with scorn, with hostility, with distrust. They would say, there's no way that this happened. A woman would call a police officer, and he would arrive at her flat, and she's bleeding and bruised, and he says, well, let me talk to your husband. And then he would go to the kitchen, close the door, and then a minute later, a woman would hear them laughing together. And then he would walk out and say, hey, you just have to make up, to reconcile. And, there's a whole range of misconceptions that result in women being met with that, not just from the police, but also from their surroundings, from their family members, from friends, sometimes even social workers, and shelters, especially government-run shelters, who, again, when I was interviewing staff from government-run shelters in Russia, they sometimes would pride themselves on, reuniting families. And that sort of will send a chill, up my spine, because I would think, well, what does that actually involve, that they would reunite a family? And that brings, of course, it, puts a huge question about the safety of women whose families they, saved, quote unquote. And this one example that comes to my mind always is example of this woman who was severely beaten for years by her husband, and at some point I think he broke her jaw, and he traumatized her children, and she was hiding from him. And then she finally went and sought help from a shelter, and she sought psychological help, and a psychologist basically told her to work on her own issues. And she was telling me all this horrifying details of what she went through. And I could see that she was upset and she was beginning to shake. And I said, look, maybe we should stop now. And, I don't want you I didn't want to re-traumatize her. So I suggested we stop the interview. And she said, well, actually, yes, I have to go home because my husband is waiting for me. And I was completely shocked. And I said, so, oh, do you mean there's the same guy you were just telling me about? And she said, well, yes, we reconciled, and I'm working very hard not to provoke him. And that's basically it's not that she's not brave, it's not that she's not strong, it's just the level of public awareness and that atmosphere that is in which these women have to fight their battles. It's public perception, it's everything.
Yeah, that concept of being having to be also just quiet about it, or not knowing where to go, or there's just so many issues with that, particularly are public perception related, let alone the legal situation. It's just the concept that that this is a thing in general, that it happens, that it's bad, that you should be able to get away from it. It's just that basic principle,
Exactly. And if we you mentioned having nowhere to go. So if we talk about number of shelters, a shelter is a place where a woman in state of crisis should be able to run to, and there are very specific standards on the number of those shelters, the number of shelter beds that should exist and operate in the country. The Council of Europe standards, and according to the Council of Europe standards, there should be at least 14,000 shelter beds in Russia, according to Russia's population, and we have less than 2,000 shelter beds. And Moscow has fewer than 150 shelter beds, and the population is over 12 million. So, it's quite striking how there are very, very few options for women, and that's why they often return to their abusers, because they literally have nowhere to go. Another huge issue is the fact that Russian law does not have protection orders, restraining orders, as they're known in the States. So that is a very specific measure that helps to save lives in the immediate term. So if a woman is in danger, especially if she comes forward and tries to complain, tries to call the police, that usually infuriates the abuser, and she needs to be protected. So, if she is in Moscow, then she at least has some options. There, more shelters, there more awareness, and more NGOs working on this issue. If she is somewhere in a village in the Urals, she does not have any options because the police will not listen to her. There is no shelter, and the police will not issue a protection order to make sure that the abuser is not allowed to approach her until she's, figuring it out, or taking her case to court, or whatever, starting criminal investigation. So they're literally there are literally no options for them but to run as far as they can, and sometimes they do, or to go back, hide for a few days at a friend's place and then go back. And when they return, usually violence, it picks right back up. And like I mentioned in the beginning, it's never, very rarely it stays the level of, slaps or the guy pushing her or, lightly hitting her. It usually escalates and escalates to very dangerous levels.
I was wondering if we could just step out a little bit and get a slightly bigger picture. So the rate that you have in the report for women in Russia who have experienced violence at the hands of their husbands or partners at some point during their lives is 1 in 5, which is quite large. Do you have numbers for comparison from other, from Western Europe or from somewhere else in the world?
Right. Well, Russia is actually not very different. If we take official numbers, so we say a 1 in 5. That's according to the last sort of detailed study, which was conducted by the Russian authorities, and it was done in 2011. Mm-hmm. And so, according to that study, it's not very different from other countries, including countries in Western Europe. But Russia is different in that it has very little reliable statistics. So statistical data that we have, it's very fragmented, and it's very difficult to make any, reliable conclusions or any assessments based on it. We know it's a latent crime. It's a latent crime everywhere. Women do not report it, or, they're afraid to report it, or they don't report for other reasons, or it's difficult for them to report it. Like in France, for instance, it was difficult for them to report it, and then they changed the rules to make it easier. That's just to say that it exists. The problem with reporting exists in all countries, basically. But also in most European countries, you can find, court records, and you can see number of sentences for criminal acts of domestic violence in a certain region, certain municipality, in given months. But in Russia, there's no such thing.
Right, because there's no law specifically.
There is no law. Yeah. Exactly. There's no definition. So, if you have, a certain number of murders committed in 2016. So you have court statistics where there are sentences. This is the number of sentences for murders, Article 105 of the Criminal Code. But there is nowhere in that statistics is there data on how many of those murders were actually perpetrated as domestic violence, because there's no category in the law. So we cannot make any clear assessment. We cannot draw any conclusions from that information unless somebody has time to kind of sift through all court records and look through each case of where harm to health was caused, or serious injuries, or battery, and figure out how many of those in a given year were committed against a family member. I mean, that's impossible. And then on the other hand, we have statistics, that's court statistics. We also have statistics by the Ministry of Interior. And that statistics basically tells you how many violent crimes were committed against a family member in 2014, 2015, 2016. It's great. But that statistics does not include all the instances where women would come to the police, but the police would refuse to start criminal investigation. That happens all the time. And after decriminalization, that became even more frequent because now police have incentive to not start criminal, and they have actually, a lawful right basically to not initiate criminal cases, even if harm to health is obviously severe. So I had cases where women had severe concussions, where they one woman spent 2 months in a hospital with a broken nose and a severe concussion. And police told her that her injuries were not serious enough for a criminal investigation, so it should be an administrative case. So all this, is really, the available statistic makes it literally impossible to understand the real number of domestic violence crimes and to make any kind of assessments about, whether it's, becoming more severe. We can say it's increasing, for example, due to the fact that after decriminalization, there are more penalties for battery under administrative code. It basically doubled since decriminalization. But again, it's not really, we can't really back it up with real numbers of every aspect of domestic violence that we need to track. And there has to be, there has to be a law on domestic violence. There has to be a definition. I don't know any other country in the post-Soviet space, except for Uzbekistan, that does not have a domestic violence law. Russia and Uzbekistan are the only two countries left who don't have a definition even of domestic violence. And if you talk about, international treaties, then Russia and Azerbaijan are the only two members of the Council of Europe who haven't ratified the Istanbul Convention. So Russia is, not in great company, and it's a quite dire situation that needs to be addressed quickly.
What is the Istanbul Convention?
Istanbul Convention is it's an international treaty. It's a Council of Europe treaty. It's called the Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. The reason why it's called Istanbul Convention is because it originated in Istanbul in 2011. And it's really... it's the most comprehensive treaty on domestic violence there is. It defines domestic violence. It defines actually a broad spectrum of violence against women, including physical, psychological, sexual, economic. And, it's a treaty that requires, like, any other treaty, it requires state parties who joined it to work to change their attitudes and practices domestically. And Russia is, like I said, Russia is the only one of two Council of Europe member states that has neither signed nor ratified this treaty.
Has the Russian government give any reason why they haven't participated in it?
Yeah, they've... Russia participated in the discussions. Sort of toyed with the idea of signing the convention in 2008, but then they expressed, as far as I remember, they had some reservations about gender-based asylum claims because, like I said, it's not just about domestic violence; it includes other types of violence against women. It's difficult to say why Russia has been, what the real reason is why Russia has been so stubborn in joining this convention, because even High Commissioner for Human Rights in Russia, which is a state official still, even though it has human rights in the title, but it's still very much aligned with the government in Russia, she spoke in favor of ratifying the convention. And she said that she saw no danger, I think, or obstacles in joining Council of Europe on that issue. But again, Russia's relations with the Council of Europe have been deteriorating so quickly that we're kind of losing hope that there will be joining any Russia will be joining any initiatives anytime soon. But it's definitely it's the most comprehensive treaty. It's basically groundbreaking treaty on violence against women and protections for women. And it's a great shame. It's a great shame that Russia hasn't joined this convention.
You kind of mentioned like Russia's deteriorating relationship with
European countries, and I want to talk about what the role of anti-Western sentiment amongst Russian legislators is, and like the role in kind of negatively impacting domestic violence law.
So anti-Western sentiment, it goes really hand in hand with traditional values rhetoric. And, in addition to things that I mentioned earlier, like, revitalizing old stereotypes and creating stigma that prevents people from coming forward when they face domestic violence at home, the anti-Western hysteria also had very negative impact on work of NGOs in Russia, non-governmental groups that also work in the area of women's rights, but not only women's rights, human rights in general. So basically, the situation now is that groups that work on LGBT rights, groups that work on environment, women's rights, children's rights, sometimes in Russia, they are often portrayed as agents of the West, as foreign agents. That's a term that was introduced in 2012 by a very unfortunate piece of legislation, which basically said that if a Russian group is receiving foreign funding, even a small portion of foreign funding, and is involved in political activity, which is defined so broadly that pretty much any activity can fall under that category. So in that case, they are foreign agents, and in Russian context, it's a very negative term. Basically, it basically means a spy or a traitor, and so it's incredibly depressing because these groups, they are actually working to fill those gaps that the government is not capable of or willing of filling. So, for example, if we're talking about domestic violence, the leading group on domestic violence, fighting against domestic violence in Russia, is a center called ANA Center. So it's a leading center that's been helping women who suffered from domestic violence and gender-based violence, for decades now. And in 2014, this group had been declared foreign agent. They're still working, but it made their life a lot more difficult because it's about public trust. It's about government wanting to not wanting to really have anything to do with them, and this legislation, foreign agents, basically forced a number of groups in Russia to shut down. The fact that their financial situation. So, anti-Western hysteria manifests itself in laws and in policies that are incredibly detrimental to civil society in Russia, including groups that work on domestic violence.
You had mentioned that the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Russia had spoken in favor of ratifying the ratifying the Istanbul Convention, and I'm wondering if you can point to other specific examples of kind of voices of reason within the government that show that there's some kind of effort right now to either reverse the effects of 2017 or kind of just improve on the situation in any way. Like that there was a bunch of recommendations in the study that you published. Who are some of those people?
Well,
or is there no more?
No. I mean, I think that, we were actually quite surprised by the fact that we did find some understanding the level of cabinet of ministers, which we did not expect to find. And there are people in the government, in the ministries that are aware and that agree that the situation with domestic violence in Russia is horrible. It needs to be addressed. They have very progressive views on legislation, that there should be law on domestic violence. For example, the Ministry of Labor, we met with the Ministry of Labor at this quite a senior level before I started the research, just to tell them that we're working on this and we really wanted their input. And then after the report was, finalized and they had a chance to look at it, and they agreed with some of our findings, including, some aspects of how shelters operate, the need for better cooperation between NGOs and governmental groups, locally. Like I said, the need for specific legislation, introducing additional protections for survivors. So, again, Ministry of Interior, the actual Minister of Interior spoke against decriminalization and said publicly that, in more than 70% of administrative cases of battery, when we're talking about domestic violence, battery within family, courts impose fines, and that does not correspond with punitive purpose of punishment. So he was basically saying that this new legislation and the penalties that it introduced, it does not serve as prevention for further violence. And he also mentioned that it adds additional burden on the family, which was, again, a crucial point, because if an abuser gets a fine, then very often that fine comes out of a family budget, which is ridiculous. So, there are a lot of supporters of domestic violence legislation. There are a lot of people in ministries, etc., who understand that things that need to be done, things that need to happen for a situation to improve. I see the main obstacle to things improving, our parliament. And it's a male-dominated parliament. In Russian parliament, in the State Duma, we have only 13% of women. The rest are men in the lower chamber of parliament. And that parliament would have a very hard time adopting legislation allowing, for instance, for protection orders, because that implies or could imply infringement on property rights, for instance, which is also a debate that's been going on in Ireland. But again, there are very clear kind of rebuffs that you can give, counter arguments that you can give to those fears, but so far we haven't succeeded, and advocates and activists pushing for legislation haven't succeeded in convincing our parliament that things need to change. And as I'm saying that, I'm also completely aware of the irony that in our male-dominated parliament, it was a group of women who pushed for decriminalization.
Mm-hmm. That's I felt like when I was reading the report, I spent some time going down maybe that not very fruitful path of trying to speculate on why legislators would make those decisions. And it's do they just hate women, or what else is going on there? It's so hard to parse, and maybe isn't even useful. But I wanted to talk about a little bit more about what happens after a survivor attempts to seek help. So in the case where, the police are called and they say, okay, the injury is not severe enough, even if it clearly isn't severe enough for public prosecution to take place, but you can go through private prosecution. What is that process, and how does it differ from public prosecution?
Sure. Well, I can start by saying that the process of private prosecution for survivors of domestic violence is incredibly unfair, and it basically shifts the burden entirely on the victim. It's a process that's been described to me by survivors as hell from beginning to end. So after a woman gets turned away by police, and police tell her that either her injuries are not severe enough, or this does not qualify as a criminal offense, or it's a criminal offense, but it's not serious enough to have a criminal investigation initiated, which also happens. Women are funneled basically by the police to private prosecution, which means that they take their case to a magistrate court judge themselves. And to do that, they have to they basically have to put their case together themselves. They have to find witnesses. They have to, make sure that they have all their injuries documented properly, which is also a challenge in Russia procedurally because of the fact that medical workers are not trained to do it right. And women most often simply don't have the knowledge to point out, if she gets at least a piece of paper from a medical worker listing her injuries, and it's not correct. There are often mistakes. It's not documented right, and the court will simply, destroy the whole case because of a mistake made by a medical worker. So if a woman does not have resources or understanding of how to put her case together herself, and she doesn't have the resources to hire a lawyer to help her, then 9 times out of 10, her case will be returned. It will not get to hearing. It will not get a hearing because of the mistakes that she will make along the way. Let's say she put her case together and it was accepted by a magistrate court judge, and she has to attend court hearings, which happen usually once, I think like maybe once every 2 months, or twice a month, and that can go on for up to a year. And women that I talk to, they have kids, they have to work, they're already traumatized, they have all these relatives and friends pushing them to reconcile with the abuser. They have to spend money to hire a lawyer, or if they don't, like I said, the case will fall apart because of, non-compliance with some legal requirement or other. And while all this is happening, the state gives state-appointed free legal defense to her abuser.
Ugh, what is that about? Why?
Well, because it's part of our legislation.
Because they're the defendant?
Exactly. They're a defendant in a private prosecution case, and they get a free state representation. Yes. So I had for instance, a very good example is this one woman that I interviewed for the report. So she and her husband were, both very successful professionals living in Moscow. That's actually another thing that was very striking to me, is that the more kind of, successful in whatever socially acceptable terms a woman is, the better her education, the more money she makes, the more, sometimes more fearful she is of actually coming forward and talking about her, about facing violence at home. And very often that happens that women like that don't say anything. They're afraid to say anything. Anyway, so in this case, her husband assaulted her, I think 23 times over 10 years, severely, like putting her in the hospital several times while they were married. And a lot of those times will actually happened while she was suing him for domestic violence after they were divorced. So basically, almost after, remember I mentioned this twice a month hearing, so almost after every hearing he attacked her. And 4 times he attacked her outside the courthouse, and no one would do anything to stop him, because no such thing as protection order. And there's, that because like I said, the system is stacked against her. If a police officer would see it, they would keep on walking. Very recently, there was a case an activist talked about on her social media page, on her Facebook page. She saw somewhere in the center of Moscow a man beating a woman at a metro station. And it was late at night, and the police and the activist that girl witnessed that. And the police officer was walking by, and he approached and tried to intervene. And the guy said, "No, that's my wife." And he showed him his ring on his finger. And the police officer was like, "Oh, okay, right on," and kind of kept on walking. So yeah, again, it's legislation is one thing, and the public awareness, the way that the system works is a whole other problem.
So, yeah, and you have, like, as Lily mentioned earlier, you have this very thorough list of recommendations in the report, kind of broken down by each segment of the government. You said that you showed the report to some people before it was published. I'm wondering, was there a public response in Russia to the report? Did the government feel like pressured to respond publicly?
Actually, there was, yes. And it's, we had response more or less directly from the Kremlin, which is pretty much unheard of when you're a human rights activist or, a human rights group working in Russia. Because the Kremlin is always this, impenetrable fortress, and it doesn't lower itself to the level of debate on human rights, at least in my memory. And I've been working in Russia for 9 years now. So we had a response from Dmitry Peskov, which is the Kremlin spokesperson, and Mr. Peskov, obviously was critical. And he said that the report was not representative of Russia, which, first of all, was not a claim that we ever made, because all Human Rights Watch reports are based on, it's non-quantitative research. It's not the methodology we use. And secondly, by criticizing us this way, Mr. Peskov basically he opened himself and the Russian government to return criticism, because there's basically no available, clear, consistent statistical data on domestic violence in Russia, because there's no adequate legislation. So they accused us of something that we could in return accuse them of, and they couldn't really back it up, and we could, because at least we had specific cases in our report and specific examples and an indication that it most likely happens on a very large scale. So that was quite interesting, because to us it was a signal that it's an issue that they pay attention to, and they realize that there's a certain amount of pressure, including international pressure, to change things, and hopefully it will lead to something. It will lead to some changes, and there are a whole lot of there's a number of great activists in Russia who have been working on domestic violence and women's rights for many, many years, and they've been accused of being agents of the West and evil feminists and all kinds of things, but they continue to work. So hopefully, sort of together, we'll be able to change things at least a little bit. I mean, there have to be at least some steps taken to change this situation, because it cannot go on like this.
Bridge, tell them that I live my life like a king, captain of my ship. Wife.
That is the episode. Thank you for listening. We'll be sure to publish along with this episode some resources for people seeking protection or ways to participate in helping survivors of domestic violence. We'll also link the report that Yulia and her team wrote, or researched and wrote, in the episode description, both in English and in Russian. And that was interesting that she wrote it in English. Did you notice that? Did you read the acknowledgements?
Oh, I didn't notice she wrote it in English.
She wrote it in English, and then somebody else translated it into Russian.
Oh, I didn't read that far in the acknowledgements.
Yeah.
I only read the first part.
As always, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Telegram at She's in Russia. Sign up for our monthly image-based newsletter at she'sinrussia.com, and become a patron saint at patreon.com/she'sinrussia.
Our patron saint.
Yeah.
What about Fortishka?
I mean, it's on that other episode. We can say it again. If you missed it on the last episode, at the beginning of the episode, we're selling off our remaining inventory from Fortichka, our Russian fashion pop-up that happened in early December. So if you missed that, like you don't live in New York or you didn't come out that weekend, go ahead and look at our Instagram, and we'll be putting up if it's not already up, we'll be putting up a link with all the leftover stuff. Sorry, excuse me, not leftover, remaining things that you can buy.
It's at Fortichka _.
Yeah, FORTOCHKA _.
Okay, cool.
All right, see you next week. The other thing that I didn't know was how often it is that physical abuse starts when the woman gets pregnant.
Yeah, what is that?
I think that's
so
some
weird.
Fucked up underlying biological thing where your like wires get crossed and you think that they're pregnant with somebody else's baby or something like that.
Oh yeah, and exactly. Like there's like so much of the like abuse is like this weird paranoid guilt complex where like in the stories that this report has, where like it's like,
Remember the one that was like, this guy was beating this woman until she told the truth about how many people she had slept with or something?
Oh, God.
And he's just like, he just made it up.
Yeah.
It's just like, he's having a paranoid
these men
attack.
are like psychos.
Yeah, they're psychos, but like they're the product of they're like a really extreme version of a lot of people's values. I mean, it's really like, that's the thing that's crazy about jealousy and like sort of normative values around monogamy, is that like it's like totally normal to be like really, really rageful about like breaking monogamy. And that's like normal, and that's like encouraged, because like the unit is the two of you, and you should not be introducing foreign agents into it. Yeah. You know?
Yeah.